What's up guys, WhoNeedsMeta here. Today we're going to be talking about Fire-Water format. When did Fire-Water format take place? And what is Fire-Water format? Fire-Water format takes place in March of 2014, but playing under the January 2014 ban list. This format got its name due to the popularity of Fire-Water, otherwise known as Firefists and Mermails. Firefist had a couple different variations of the deck based around either +1 of Firefist, which using a very limited amount of monsters, using card-D and tanky and things like that to go +1, hence the name. Essentially, at one point in time, we had a level 3 variant of the deck that used synchro plays with cards like Spirit, but that version of the deck was significantly less popular as Spirit was at 1 at the time, but you could splash that engine into the +1 deck and hence the name 3.5 Axis. Mermails, on the other hand, typically revolved around using Gund and recycling Gund with cards like Pike and Turge to make rank 4s and moving away from the rank 7 engine that we would see in prior formats. Of course, Mermails being a rank 4 deck, we do have Legacy of the Valiant as the last legal set. This set introduced cards like 101 and Exciton to the card pool, which definitely are format defining cards. Outside of those decks, there are quite a few other decks that we can play, and I'm going to go into those later on in the video and kind of show some lists and some options you have if you choose to play this format. This format typically takes a backseat to Hat format in terms of popularity, but in my opinion, it is the most fun version of the rank 4 toolbox era. And as an important aside, this format is a draw 6 1 field spell format. The first list I'd like to look at is +1 Firefist. You can tell by the smaller monster lineup that this deck might struggle in longer games unless you're able to reoccur and protect your 3 copies of Wolfbark. This is really what makes the deck work. In April, you'll see like decks like Fat and things like that, which utilize a smaller Firefist engine simply because this card would be eventually put to 1. Or you can also see that it's playing 3 copies of Upstart Goblin. This is kind of a contentious point whether or not you want to do this because the deck struggles to kill people fast enough. It's whether or not you can have enough resources where that 1,000 life points might be an issue, especially if you activate multiple over a long game. We'll also take a look at the trap lineup here just for a second. You'll notice that out of the limited traps that were played in a lot of decks, being Warning, Torrential, Bottomless, and Compulse. Compulse is kind of on the lower end of the totem pole in this format because a lot of times like bouncing a Bear really isn't good. Bouncing a Megalo or a Tias really just isn't that good. Same thing with like a card like a Yamato. So you'll see that until the trap lineup gets incredibly robust in bigger trap heavy decks, and we're not going to see a lot of compulsory evacuation devices, but this is typically considered one of the better, if not the best deck of the format. I did briefly want to touch on the +1 variant of the deck. Some of them would play Murmillos. Even some other decks will be playing Murmillos in their +1 deck. This is kind of what the upstarts would become. But you'll notice there's only 2 Wolfbark and cards like Spirit, which is limited, Rooster, Leopard, and then the Tiger or the Horse Princes in the extra deck to go along with the Tiger Kings. And then, of course, the Lion Emperor. So you have these rank 3 and level 6 synchro plays to go into as well. Next list I'd like to get into is Water, of course. So rounding out the Fire-Water section. We'll notice that there's only 1 Megalo. And like I said, we will be looking at more of a Pike, Turge, Gund-centric build with all of the rank 4s here in the extra deck. Even the Aqua Spirits. I've elected to not play the Osha combo in my list. I also don't play Reckless Greeds. I know Hoban played Reckless Greeds in a few of his builds. It's just not for me. I believe that the card kind of locks you into when you're playing against decks like longer grind games against decks like Yurgia and Firefist and Bujins, especially when they play Kaiser. You're going to lack the ability to get back into games when a Reckless essentially locks you out of 2 cards and it becomes a -1 if you don't have multiples. So it does increase the ceiling, but for me, it just didn't seem worth it. But this is kind of a generic Upstart Hoban Mermail list. This is my Bujin list that I really like. I think Bujin is kind of a sleeper pick. We don't have Pryo, obviously, so we don't have Harume. But I really like this deck, and I really feel like it is underrepresented, especially with the amount of power that Kaiser Coliseum can provide you. We will take a look at also a little bit here, the side deck, some of the side deck cards. Maxi is pretty common against certain decks. It's not very good against half the meta like this and Firefist and Evil Swarms and things like that, Prophecy. It's just not as good, but you'll notice cards like Full House to be able to hit stuff, especially if a deck plays copies of Fiendish Chain, and you can use your own face-ups. If you're a tanky deck and a Fiendish Chain deck, Full House is definitely a big possibility. Memory of an Adversary is also really good in the mirror for this deck. I really like it in this, so this is another a few cards to consider for the sideboard. But for the main board in terms of Bujins, it's pretty standard. You summon Yamato, but Mikazuchi does add some pretty cool utility along with Arasuda. There's just a lot of cool stuff you can do with this deck, and it is a really fun Sun deck and a really fun Protect the Castle deck, especially because cards like 101, we have outs to those, to things like 101 and destruction effects and other things like that. Next up is Infernity. What I really like about this deck is the Transmodifies. I'm not an Infernity guy, but I really think Transmodify is really cool to be able to use cards like Necromancer and Archfiend in unintended ways with Transmodify, because typically this was supposed to be the Firefist card for the 3 and 4 access and how that deck would work. And this is the deck that actually kind of utilized it to its fullest potential. This is kind of our, like, we don't play this card anymore when Soul Charge comes out, essentially. So this is kind of the precursor to Soul Charge and how that would work. We do have 3 barrier. This is us only opting to play 2. The barrier to break ratio is kind of different depending on the player, but this is kind of a standard Infernity deck with Transmodify, which is a really cool tech that I like. Next, we're going to be looking at Geargia. Geargia's biggest obstacle in this format, besides losing the die roll, is just Pike and Bear, and so we need a lot of cards to be able to protect that. So you'll notice the text copy of Skill Prisoner. This card is really cool, and it helps you protect your guys. And then, of course, the Veilers in the main deck, the 3 Fiendish Chains, and then, of course, we have Geargia Gear now. This is a card that we wouldn't have been able to play in September 2012 when the deck first came out, but we do have that, and one of those the 3 copies Gear Gigant. This is a more standard build for a pure build, and then if we want to take a look at the Karakuri build, this one allows for the ability to end the game a little bit quicker, but it does lose a bit of that trap lineup, so it is kind of player preference which you prefer. Crimson Blader is really good in a lot of matchups, and having access to easy Crimson Blader and easy Scrap Dragon and things like that is pretty popular. Scrap Dragon is obviously really good in the mirror to hit your opponent's armor, but we've only able to play like 2 copies of Gigant in a very limited rank 4 and rank 3 package, because we have to put these synchro monsters that we have access to in here. So that is something to consider, whether or not you want to be able to go for the explosive plays or have a much better grind game with a ton more options in your extra deck for rank 4s. So that is something to consider when you're picking a variant of Geargia. Next up, we have Heretic Rulers. Heretic Rulers is probably the most explosive deck. Maybe Mermail's more, but this deck has access to Skill Drain, which I think is really good in a lot of matchups, especially the Firefist matchup. Maybe not so much the Bujin matchup, but I do really think Skill Drain works very, very well in this deck. You'll notice there are no main deck MSTs because we have copies of Sue. So we'll be using that as kind of our back row popper when we don't have Skill Drain. And then the copy of Wingbeat of Giant Dragon to essentially bounce one of our dragons, either the Tefnuits and then keep going, or we could bounce one of our Dragon Rulers. But these are kind of the explosive plays that the deck can make. This is Chris LeBlanc's list, who opted to main deck Heretics from the Ashes. I think this card is pretty cool. It's pretty debated on whether or not it's actually any good. I really like it. I think the ability to have more versatility with this card and then allow to abuse the Dragon Rulers a little bit easier, in my opinion, makes it worth it. And then, of course, the copies of Dragon Shrine, which act as Foolish Burials. We're not playing Foolish Burial. This card does have a hard once per turn, but the ability to send 2 dragons makes it better than Foolish Burial. So we would max out on this copies of this card before we play Foolish Burial. So this will always be a 3 of, and then the 4th can be the Foolish Burial. But 3 Dragon Shrines helps us set up our graveyard for all our Dragon Rulers and allow us to combo off, especially because the Heretics can fetch vanillas from deck or grave. So if we send them, they're still usable in the graveyard, and then we don't have to worry about bricking and drawing vanillas. Next up, we have Harpies, who are kind of a mid-range deck. I just want to just briefly point out this deck a little bit because I do think it's a lot of fun. Being able to do funny combos with Sign as well as being able to play trap cards. It's kind of like playing Gear Karakuri, but you don't have to worry about setting. You have cards like Channeler who can get things out of the deck, and it's not a trap card like Gear is. It's just a little bit more susceptible to removal, and it's a little bit more fragile. So doesn't have the ability to like gain a bunch of resources like Geargia would and then go off, but the deck doesn't need to set things to go off, so that's kind of the trade-off between this and Geargia. And of course there are a couple like bigger beaters like Queen and things like that are bigger monsters in the deck. And then of course Hunting Ground, being able to not only have a field spell to play over Gates of the Dark World if you play that matchup, but be able to consistently have back row removal. Again, no copies of MST in the main deck. And Hunting Ground is really good with a card like Trap Stun. I like Trap Stun a lot in this deck because typically with a card like Dancer, you would play, like in earlier formats, we would play a card like 7 Tools over Trap Stun and something like X-Sabers because if our opponent had Max C. But this allows you to pop multiple back rows and conduct multiple summons without using a special summon. So that's kind of like why I like Dancer and the Trap Stuns over a card like 7 Tools. Because you don't have to worry about Maxi in a play with Dancer. I don't have too much to say about Prophecy. It is a fairly solid deck. It really depends on the matchup and things like that where this deck is going to be any good and your ability to be able to recycle Fate. This deck, I mean, it does get the nickname Brick Books because of its ability to open dead hands, not open any spell books or any usable spell books, or if your blue boy gets Veiler turn 1 and you're really struggling. But I do think the deck is worth mentioning because it does have a high ceiling. Again, the ability to gain advantage in hands. I just think Geargia is a bit more consistent in terms of gaining those hands, but Spellbook of Fate is still a really strong card, and it is really good with dealing with a lot of different problems that the deck may have. So if you're able to set this card up successfully and being able to recycle it again and again with Tower, that's when the deck can really start snowballing and steal you some wins. Next, we're going to be looking at Evil Swarms. Evil Swarms is another rank 4 toolbox deck with heavy emphasis placed on Ophion, but we do have cards like Bahamut and Nightmare that are pretty useful, and Exciton Knight is actually being able to be protected with a card like Pandemic, so there is extra utility with Exciton, and you can even justify playing multiple copies in your deck. The Zenmanes is for the Exceed Encore when your opponent plays that card to have something to go into when that happens to you, because we don't have a Universe yet. But it is a matchup dependent deck. We do have copies of Kaiser, but we also can see Skill Prisoner and Fiendish Chain to protect our Ophion from things like Bear, and keeping it from being popped. Again, also copies of Effect Failure. The one of Thunder King, also really popular tech in decks that don't search because the card is limited. And of course we have Rescue Rabbit, which can summon our Heliotropes, and we can always put those back with Infection if we were to draw them, so it's not as much of a brick, and being 1950 also helps, and we can just summon it with a card like Caster. I also wanted to end the video on kind of a fun deck, Hunders. Again, another rank 4 deck that can also run level 8 Synchros, and being able to use cards like Stardust, Spark, and then of course Crimson Blader, which are really good in this format depending on the matchup. You also do get access to cards like Polydynamo and Omega that other decks would not have access to, but this is kind of just another generic rank 4 deck, and then we can side into Spark Dragon Emptiness if we go first, which is kind of cool. But Thunder Seahorse is just a really cool card. Honest, Thunder King is being able to be utilized by being a light and things like that, so this card fits under the goes in match style strategy, which you don't actually see sided, because a lot of the decks you'll notice are mono in terms of attribute, not necessarily type like Murmels or all different kinds, but there are a lot of the decks here are mono attribute, which is why you're not seeing goes in match in any of the side decks. It's just not as good and not really played in anything. But I did like the Violon Prism and the Thunder Seahorses and stuff like that, and being able to have access to those cards, and just being able to recycle cards with Sis, and use Mon Pa to create explosive boards. It's just kind of a fun deck that your opponent may not sing. So if there's anything I missed, I didn't want to mention Lightsworn Rulers or Dark Worlds because I don't think they're as good, although Creator Dark Worlds are a pretty cool deck if you've ever been able to play them. But I just wanted to focus on some of the more main decks, otherwise this video will be extremely long just talking about random decks of the format. But I do really like a lot of these decks. They are a lot of fun. This format is a lot of fun and is very underrated, and I definitely think more people should go ahead and give it a try. So that'll be all for today's video. Be sure to like and subscribe and comment down below what your favorite deck of this format is, what you played during this format if you played, and thanks for watching, guys.